So let's talk about some ideas of getting new 40k armies off the ground, with one example 1000 point starter list for every single Warhammer faction. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking starter army lists in Warhammer 40k. This video has been a project that I've wanted to get done for really quite a while now, so glad to finally get it done. There's plenty of ways that you can choose to start a Warhammer 40k army, and maybe just to give some people ideas and visualise it a bit better, I thought we'd do one 1000 point starter list for each faction, maybe a little bit more than the 500 points that you might get roughly from one combat patrol box, but before thinking about shooting for a really big army and building towards a 2000 point list that you often see listed at tournaments, this one is going to be a little bit rough and ready. My general aim is going to be to start from a combat patrol box set for the vast majority of factions, then build up that discount kit to an 1000 point army, and taking a combination of units to do so that's either at least somewhat effective in game, or gets quite a lot of points on the board for the money, which certainly can be helpful when you're starting out. Then beyond that, for each army, I'll just talk about 3 different units which you could think about expanding beyond the core force, which definitely could be options for going towards 1000 points in the first place. I think realistically there's a lot of different ways that you can build each faction, and I'm sure if I remade the video, each army list could be done really quite differently. There's definitely other considerations that you could have as well, if you're thinking about converting or proxying any models, for example. For this one, I've broadly decided just to stick with Games Workshop plastic kits for simplicity, but in reality there's a whole load of clever things and conversions that you can do with some factions to help a practical force get off the ground quicker. In any case though, let's jump into it. We'll go through Imperium, then Chaos, then Xenos, and feel free to let me know any other hints or tips with starting an army down in the comments, any insights or guidance that you'd give for people getting into your own faction. Starting with the Space Marines, and in the initial draft of this video, I was initially planning on going for the mix of the Blood Angels Combat Patrol and the Dark Angels one, though Games Workshop do seem to have now taken down the Blood Angels one. In absence of that, I thought we'd start building around the 40k starter set. That'll be $112 and comes with some Tyranids that are left over as well. So in reality, if you could split the kit with a Tyranid player, then you could get this for less. Besides that, to make the army, we've gone for a set of Hellblasters, a Primaris Lieutenant, a Space Marine Gladiator, and a couple of sets of Jump Intercessors, so a $413 army here. To make that into a fighting force, I've gone for a Gladius Task Force formation here. This is the one with the combat doctrines that gives you turns of advance and shoot, advance and charge, and fall back, shoot and charge. Lots of things to support both firepower and melee units, and it has the big cool combo of the fire discipline one. So we've got a lieutenant with power fist and plasma pistol here, and he's going to be leading the big squad of 10 Hellblasters. Where in Devastator Doctrine you'll be able to get lethal hits and sustained hits all on 5s, and reroll everything with Oath of Moment hopefully. They're such a scary force that they should be able to delete the vast majority of things in their path. Hellblasters are just quite a nice unit for Space Marine players to get early, I think, as well. You get loads of points in the box, and they're just quite an easy to use general purpose unit. The fights on death means that they're just not that punishing, even if the opponent does manage to bring them down. Otherwise, from the starter set, we get a bunch of Terminators, a Terminator Librarian, and a Captain with the Power Sword, and he'll be leading the squad of monopose Terminators with the Assault Cannon. I'd think about rapid ingressing them potentially. One downside of the starter set is that you do have an isolated Terminator character, and I think as you build out the army a little bit more, I'd either think about subbing him out for something, or maybe eventually getting him a Terminator retinue of his own if you wanted to use both characters. For a bit of objective skirmishing, there's a squad of Infernus Marines. I'm not sure they'd be my top choice for holding down objectives. They don't have as much OC as the Intercessors or the Assault Intercessors, but at least they do have their advantage of big overwatch when they need it. They might hold a home objective or skirmish in the midfield as it makes sense. The 2 squads of Jump Intercessors are just fast moving, really quite nice objective skirmishers in themselves. You could put one in Deep Strike Reserve to do secondary objectives, and they just bully light infantry units quite well. I've equipped them with power fists and plasma pistols here. And then for a bit of dedicated anti-tank firepower, we've got a Gladiator Lancer, just so enemy vehicles and heavies can't really relax when that thing's around. Ideally hide and get the first strike on something, and you don't even need to use Oath of Moment to make it scarier. Perhaps for some ideas for expanding beyond that, I feel like a Scout Squad would be really quite a good choice for Space Marines going forward. $65 for 10 Marines isn't the worst, plus they're just really nice to screen out the midfield and potentially jump around the board doing secondary objectives with their return to reserves. You could maybe think about a way to deliver the Hellblasters to ensure they get the strike on something important with that big combo, perhaps a floating repulsor. It's quite tough and has quite a lot of guns for how many points it costs. And given that Space Marines have quite so many discount options, you could think about the Vanguard Task Force or Dark Angels Combat Patrol to get a bunch of kits at a discount. Or maybe if you were able to get your hands on half of the Leviathan box, maybe sold on eBay, that could be a way to start the entire thing as opposed to the starter set. I'd probably do that instead rather than get both though. Before we move on, if you are looking to pick up any units for your 40k armies, if you're going with Games Workshop plastics, then I'd certainly use discount retailers in your area to save a bit of money on them. I've got a collection of them links down in the video description. 15% off miniatures and Element Games in the UK, 21% off in Gap Games in Australia, 10% off in Fenris Workshop in Canada, and 15% off in Wargame Portal in the USA. Those are all links down in the video description, and if you do buy anything through there, a small amount goes to help support Auspex Tactics, so a big thank you to anyone using them. They do save a bit of money versus the Games Workshop web store, and it doesn't cost any more to use those links, but there are plenty of other good discount retailers available, of course. Moving on, next up we've got the Astra Militarum. Again, like most of them, we're going to start building from the Combat Patrol, the one with the Field Ordnance Batteries, the Infantry and the Sentinel. Then I think it's important early when collecting guards to build up a good amount of tanks. They generally tend to be the more efficient way of actually getting points on the table, far more so than infantry, and they're certainly the things that help take down enemy heavies now. And then for a bit of support, I've gone for a little bit more artillery in a Basilisk, some Abhuman Brutes to hold the midfield in the Bulgrin, and a Chimera to transport some infantry. For most armies it's pretty handy to have at least one copy of the faction standard transport. Guard are generally considered a pretty pricey army to collect, and that's reflected here. The total of this is $500. Organising that all into an army list, the Combat Patrol gets us a command squad and 2 different infantry units. In my experience, really quite a lot of guard armies tend to go for one unified infantry theme, and then just say use Cadians or Death Corps for example, and use those miniatures to represent all the infantry datasheets. So for this one we've used 10 of the Cadians as the actual shock troops datasheets to go with the command squad, and then 10 more to be equipped with flamers and to proxy them as Kaschan jungle fighters, and they'll be running into the midboard in the Chimera. That's a really cheap and annoying objective scorer, and between the Kaschans and the Chimera itself, which are equipped with heavy flamers, it can be pretty ruinous to any enemy light infantry. The command squad will likely sit with the Cadian shock troops holding the home objective and using its Master Vox to broadcast out orders to infantry in the midfield, the field ordnance batteries, and maybe the Sentinel if needed. Then for armoured support, we've got one Lehman Russ fielded as a tank commander. That one takes the Demolisher Cannon, Melters, Las Cannon and Stubber. It doesn't get the benefits of the lethal hits from Born Soldiers, but is still certainly a damage force to be reckoned with. It can give the other tank an order to allow you to hit on a 3+, and the shoots on death rule with the tank commander can be very nasty as well. A huge Demolisher Cannon worth of shooting in the enemy's turn. Beyond that, I've gone quite artillery heavy with this one. A Basilisk with a heavy bolter and the field ordnance guns, which were equipped with bombast field guns. I'll be using those to chip away at either fragile enemy units that are super valuable or key objective holders. The Basilisk can be massive with its rule to slow down a key unit each turn as well. Very nasty at preventing things like Terminators getting into melee. A Scout Sentinel will venture forward and spot targets for some rerolls with the Lehman Russ. And then 3 Bulgrins will venture into the midfield alongside those Kaschans to scrap over the central objectives and provide a tanky front line as opposed to people directly targeting tanks. Finally, the other Lehman Russ have chosen to field as a nice cheap Lehman Russ Vanquisher here. I could have happily gone for other variants, maybe if you shifted the points around a little bit. The Vanquisher Cannon's very much all or nothing, but can certainly end a big armoured vehicle in a single shot. I still got all the special weapon support with multi-melters, a Las Cannon and a heavy stubber, so tons of anti-armour coming off that chassis. For ideas for expanding, certainly with the current guard rules, I'd be tempted to pick up Lord Solar Leontus. It's pretty much auto-include in just about every competitive guard list between 3 godly orders, 3 command points and redeploys. Though lots of people do like to convert something custom to represent him though. Some like the sort of Imperial Noble version that he has here, some don't. The Rogolorn battle tank could be a big reinforcement to the armoured firepower. A spectacularly efficient datasheet and a real problem for enemies to deal with, plus quite a nice model I think. And maybe some Attilan Rough Riders could be interesting as a countercharge threat. They get used in competitive lists quite a lot these days. Really quite fragile, but they hit incredibly hard with those hunting lances if they get the charge into something important. Next up, for the forces of the Omnissiah, we have the Adeptus Mechanicus. These are fairly widely known to be Warhammer 40k's most expensive army for most people, and that certainly seems to be the case here. Just in filling up 1,000 points worth of forces, I've gone for the Combat Patrol, and then between the rest of the kits, it totals a whopping $616. Less than 2 points per dollar for this, it seems. I guess you could sub out some of the units for something like some Castellan robots perhaps. Maybe in practical terms that could have been a better way to go. Otherwise though, I've tried to go for a Hunter cohort type list, 2 Iron Strider Ballistari, a Skitarii Marshal, another box of Skitarii to reinforce the regular ones as battle lines so important, a Scorpius Dune Rider to get them from A to B, and a squad of Cash from Breachers and an Honoured Dune Crawler for some heavy firepower. Put that all together and this is what you get, a Skitarii Hunter cohort list, which is the one that gets you a bit of extra durability at range and has some very nasty sneaky tricks for the Skitarii, things like preventing units being shot, returning to reserves, and a 5+ feel no pain. The force is led by that Skitarii Marshal who's taken the Cantic Thrallnet to allow one unit to double up on Doctriners. For this one he might go with the Rangers and support the Cash from Breachers to allow them to get 4 rerolls, plus the boosted version of the Doctriners. Extra AP on those arc rifles will be nice. Then there's a squad of Skitarii Vanguard being transported up the board in the Scorpius Dune Rider. That should put some nice objective debuffing troops in the mid-board and hopefully score points, plus they do have lots of nice volume fire. There's a unit of Cerberus Raiders to scout into the mid-board and skirmish with the enemy over objectives, a unit of Taraxi Sterilizers that can hopefully bounce around the board doing secondary objectives with the option to return to reserve. As mentioned, there's the 3 Cash from Breachers with arc rifles and hydraulic claws just for general purpose nasty damage dealing, and the Tech Priest Manipulus from the Combat Patrol box will be joining them, rerolling all hits near battle line things, and they're just very efficient against anything that they shoot really. Finally, for a bit of dedicated anti-tank to take down heavies, we've got 2 Iron Strider Ballistari with las cannons, and then an Honoured Dune Crawler with a neutron laser, who could also help out the Skitarii nearby, giving them a 4+ invulnerable save as well, so could run alongside the Rangers perhaps. For ideas for expanding beyond that, I'd be kind of tempted to get some Sicarian Infiltrators. It's nice to have maybe at least one unit of them to hold the mid-board. Some Rust Stalkers wouldn't be the worst idea as well if you are playing Skitarii Hunter cohort. As mentioned, Castellan robots could be a good choice if your main focus is actually getting points on the board, even if they maybe aren't considered super strong outside of cohort Cybernetica where they're okay. And in general, at some point I'd probably pick up yet more Skitarii troops of either Rangers or Vanguard. They are kind of integral to the way that the army functions at the moment, handing out the boosted versions of the Doctriners. They do take a long time to paint, but at the same time I do think that they're some of the best looking units in the army. Moving on to the Sisters of Battle, and the Sororitas are another very expensive faction in Warhammer 40k. For building up an army for them, I've chosen the Combat Patrol, a unit of 5 Seraphim, a Castigator tank, an Immolator, and a Rhino, and then a unit of pain-bringing Mortarfire engines, all this for a total of $531. Again, they are one of Games Workshop's more expensive armies. For fielding them, I've chosen to go with the very popular and very deadly Bringers of Flame for this. That's the detachment that helps out their close range shooting, which tends to be exactly what the Sisters want. +1 strength on Melters and Flamers within 12 inches, plus the Assault keyword are both really big. Leading the detachment, we've got a Fighty Canoness with Blessed Blade and Righteous Rage. She'll be leading the small squad of Celestian Sacrosands. They've taken halberds and could either think about foot slogging up the board or catching a ride in one of the transports. We've then got a Battle Sister squad, which have taken a melter gun and multi-melter on. I'd be quite tempted to split them in half, with 5 of them going in the Immolator, likely the ones with the melter weapons, and the other squad staying to camp the home objective with their sticky objective type rule. Quite nice to get 2 units of cheap troops running around. There's some blendy melee from the Arco-Flagellants that could be a good choice for going in the Rhino unless the Sacrosands want that. They could just go bursting out from behind terrain though, and then hit the enemy with their extremist trigger word, hopefully aiming for light enemy infantry if they can. Seraphim are generally pretty good in most lists. They get to move, shoot, move, so it can be really nasty skirmishing with enemies. Their hand flamers are particularly savage in Bringers of Flame, and you definitely could build out to more of them. We've talked about the transports a bit already, but alongside them we've got a couple of Mortifiers who have taken heavy bolters here. I could have happily gone for the Flamers as well, and they'll be working alongside a Castigator tank with a battle cannon to ignore cover, which just puts out some nice longer range volume fire, and also debuffs one unit for a bit of extra AP, which could be kind of helpful to buff Mortifier heavy bolters and make them go off a bit more savagely. Sisters do have a lot of very nasty damage dealers and powerful things at the moment. Maybe if I was expanding that list towards 2,000 points, some of these will be tempting. More than Vile and Paragon Warsuits are quite a strong choice in game at the moment with their enormous damage dealing. Certainly monsters and vehicles are going to go down very quickly with all those multi-melters with +1 to wound and re-rolling wound rolls. They also work out as some of the better Sisters points per the money as well, which helps. The Triumph of St. Catherine is no auto-include in competitive lists. It just farms out some lovely extra miracle dice, plus has a bunch of handy buffing auras, including an extra movement one which can get stuff moving towards the enemy dead quickly. And I'd be tempted to fill out that squad of Seraphim into a squad of 10 of them, plus a jump cannoness alongside, to basically jump around and douse things with a whole bunch of devastating wounds. Next up, for maybe a bit more of a simple army, we've got the Imperial Knights. Knights are always going to be a bit of a slightly weird skew list at 1,000 points. For this one, we've gone for 2 sets of 2 Knight Armigers and 1 Knight Questoris. Ideally, if you did have the time and effort to spare, I'd lightly magnetise at least the Questoris, and I'd go for the Armigers too. Compared with most kits, they're a bit easier to do. That means that you could flex between different forces of Knights if you wanted to. They're the cheapest so far out of these 1,000 point lists at $368. In this force of big stompy robots, we've got a Knight Errant leading the way. He's 405 points. I think ideally I would have gone for Canis Rex, just because he is an immensely dangerous special character at the moment, though it's more a case of the points not really lining up neatly. The Knight Errant is certainly massively dangerous though. A thermal cannon that's pretty much death incarnate for vehicles if it gets up close, and one of the cheaper big Questoris Knights. Then to support him, we've got 2 Armiger Helverins with the auto cannons, really nice for taking down fly units, plus just nice gun turrets to be holding the home field potentially, or playing a little bit cagier. And then 2 Armiger Warglaves, typically the Knight rank and file to be fighting on the front line, scary melter weapons, and a good general purpose melee profile. And important to have a fair few Armigers, given that they're going to be the most expendable troops and can do the objectives and things, and you're not putting all your eggs in one basket with just a few really big ones. I feel like for Knights, if you're trying to collect a well-rounded force of them, there's just all sorts of different ways that you could very easily expand to. A lot of them feel pretty even to me. A Dominus Knight, like a Castellan in particular, would be nice, though again you can magnetise. That'll give you at least the 3 standard chassis from the Codex on offer. Another Questoris is really reasonable, given there's so many variants of that, loads of lists that you might want to run 2 of those in. If building towards 2,000 points, I'd probably build up at least another 2 Armigers. Or for other choices, you could go for something like a Cerastus Knight Lancer, or maybe go for some Imperial Agents for a little bit of objective support. Some lone operative assassins or some Voidsmen at arms and things can be really valuable to stop you having to use cheapish but not that cheap Armigers to do grunt work like actions. Moving on, and as you probably expect, the Adeptus Custodes do seem to be the most economical out of the 1,000 point armies to build. It wasn't that hard to get to 1,000 points with just literally 1 combat patrol, and I've chosen to support that with 2 boxes of Sisters of Silence. That's $288, and it's the cheapest one out of these example armies. To put that force together, I've chosen to use the Shield Host, which is the most commonly used attachment competitively for Custodes these days. A bunch of helpful things for skirmishing in the midboard, plus a nice simple core melee damage buff each turn, either critical hits or extra AP. The contents of the combat patrol basically gets us almost the entire way to an 1,000 point army. For this one we've got a Blade Champion that'll be leading a squad of Custodian Wardens. He's got some quite nice heavy hitting melee and can allow the squad to advance and charge, which gets them to combat where they need to be, and then the Wardens are the tanky Custodes where they have the -1 to wound and the feel no pain. So between them you get a fairly fast moving, hard hitting and tough squad. Then there's a regular shield captain with a Guardian Spear, which is basically built out of the Custodian Guard kit. They're also taking the Guardian Spears as well, and they're the harder hitting Custodes with the reroll wound rolls and the double shoot abilities, plus the captain can allow them some nice free stratagems. Potentially their shooting can get really savage in this detachment using the shooting buff stratagem plus their inbuilt rules. Then there's a squad of 3 Allarus Custodians. Again, they take the Guardian Spears over the Castellan Axis here. It's just better against the vast majority of targets, unfortunately, for Games Workshop's balance. They could be a unit that you could do some big plays with, given that they can teleport across the board, potentially on turn 1. Ideally, they want to drop somewhere annoying, hopefully use their shooting with those grenade launchers to thin out some hordes, and then maybe get into close combat with an enemy character or monster or vehicle unit, given their rerolls rule. Finally, for a bit of grunt work and objective support, we've got some Sisters. One unit's just low investment prosecutors that could hold a home field objective provided there's no threat to them, and then one unit is Witch Seekers for some scouting into the midboard. Could be nice for doing some secondaries or screening, and they get a touch more damage with their flamers. For expanding the army, if you're going towards 2,000 points, I think realistically another combat patrol is a perfectly reasonable purchase. That'll be 10 guards, 10 wardens, and 6 terminators, including any shield captains that you built out of them. A big core of the army for cheaper than any other faction can get. Kyria Draxus could be an interesting Inquisitor to ally. She works really nicely with Custodian Guard. I'd probably get some Virtus Praetors as well. They're not super powerful in game right now, but they're pretty cool models in my opinion, and given that 40k rules tend to change so much, they're unlikely to remain bad permanently. If you did want to dip into more pricey Forge World things, my top picks would probably be the Caladius Grav Tank for some dedicated anti-armor firepower, or some of those rather awesome Venatari Custodians with the jump packs with their free rapid ingress. They're very nasty. From gold to silver armor now, and for Grey Knights the buying list is even more simple, a little bit more spendy than the Custodes, but for this I've literally just gone for 2 copies of Combat Patrol Grey Knights, being quite a nice little microcosm of the faction in itself. Grey Knights are currently one of the most affordable armies to build up, though admittedly I feel like a few people are a bit apprehensive of going too heavy on them right now, just due to the fact that they're all firstborn scale miniatures bar Castell and Crow, and it seems inevitable that at some point they're going to get a scale update with the Terminators and their Strike Marines. It's just a question of when. In any case though, 2 combat patrols basically gets enough for an entire 1000-point army, and still have a big Terminator squad and a second Librarian left over. It is kind of weird that you could literally get 3 copies of the Combat Patrol, have a 2000-point army list pretty much, and it wouldn't even be bad. In any case, leading the way we've got a Brotherhood Librarian with his Vortex of Doom Mortal Wounds. That can work pretty nicely, jumping out of the warp with his Teleport Strike. I think he'd likely want to lead the Brotherhood Terminators, though I have seen people occasionally run them solo for secondary support type things. Either way, I've chosen to give the Brotherhood Terminators their standard Apothecary and Banner upgrades, plus an Incinerator for a little Horde clearance. They could be a nice focal unit to use Grey Knight stratagems on, like Mist of Deimos, or maybe rapid ingressing to get them into melee perhaps. Then for the Power Armor Marines that we've got, I've gone for 1 squad of Strike Marines. They can be used to jump around and do sticky objective things, including putting that on the home objective turn 1 hopefully. And then we've got a squad of Interceptors with their personal teleporters, a similar kind of profile and not as much objective control, but they can move nice and fast across the board and potentially move, shoot, move as well if needed. That's handy for secondary objectives and things, and just getting the jump on the enemy rather than the other way around. Finally, to add some big muscle to the list and be a good threat against vehicles, we've got those 2 Nemesis Dread Knights. They both take a heavy Incinerator to cut through enemy troops, a Psy Cannon with its Strength 10 Damage 3 profile. That's one of the best Grey Knights anti-tank weapons currently, and a Nemesis Greatsword, though you could equally take the Hammer. They also move nice and quickly with their Advance and Charge. For expanding that, in terms of the actual rank and file unit, another Combat Patrol is actually pretty reasonable. It's got a good mix of the units in good proportions. I might be tempted to convert one of the Terminator Librarians into a different flavour of character though. Otherwise, for some character leaders, Caldor Drago is pretty reasonable with Terminators, gives you a near guaranteed charge out of Deep Strike if you budget a command point reroll. And Castell and Crow would be a high Grey Knight on the priority list for me, given that he is one of the only modern era sculpts that they have, and quite a cool miniature as well with his Cursed Blade. He would ideally want a big squad of Purifiers to run alongside though. Next up, for technically 40k's newest faction right now are the Imperial Agents, made into an army that you can properly run as an army with their new codex, though at the moment we're still waiting on their points costs. For their force, I've chosen to take a Combat Patrol, so that's the one with the Priest, Exaction Squad and the Eversaw Assassin, and then just given the nature of the army and the fact they don't really have all that many things to take down tough stuff, I've gone for 2 Grey Knight Terminator squads and then 2 Deathwatch Veteran squads to bulk out as much of the rest as possible with their militant wings. Largely thanks to the Grey Knight Terminators, the total cost of this is around about $380, which is less than some of them. This one's a very rough and ready estimate, as the points cost of the army haven't been released at time of recording. They should be along in around about a week's time, and whether or not certain squads are either super expensive or super cheap could have a big deal as to how people might want to build the faction. For an early take though, the Imperialist fleet detachment does look like it's fairly all-round usable, or at least as much as it gets in the codex so far. I feel like for the other ones to get good, the core militant wing unit I think would have to be kind of weirdly cheap. In any case, the fleet detachment allows you some reserve shenanigans and has a fun enhancement where you can infiltrate units, so the priest will take that enhancement, and you can use that to put the Deathwatch kill teams in the midboard, giving you a couple of scary threats armed with heavy thunder hammers, frag cannons and xenophase blades. They ideally want to lurk in cover somewhere and dare the enemy to get any closer unless they want to have them step up and hit them with a bunch of close range damage. Then the Grey Knight Terminator squads will maybe think about rapid ingressing to get them into melee. Hopefully if they can charge onto an objective, they can use the stratagem from Imperialis fleet, and that'll give them sustained hits and +1 to wound, so hopefully could be one good way of taking down tough stuff. Then for holding the points and providing some objective control, we've got one unit of Inquisitorial Agents who take the Multi-Melter and the Priest to go with them, and then 2 Exaction Squads for some 4+ save troopers with a few fun special weapons, and their medics can allow them to regenerate some models, which can be nice enough if you're holding points. I think at the moment it kind of remains to be seen exactly how viable they'll be at big games. I feel like at 1,000 points they've got a bit more chance of making a go of it. Perhaps for expanding the army beyond that, you could think about Lord Inquisitor Kyria Draxus. She's got fairly punchy shooting just in herself, and being able to hide a squad from long-range shooting is quite a big deal too. If you were going to build around the Imperialist fleet, it makes sense to actually get some Voidfarers units on the go. Maybe the Road Trader Entourage and the Voidsmen at Arms could be good. Maybe some Navy Breaches as well. Having the Deep Strike enhancement for some Voidsmen at Arms could be pretty good fun. To have units with their shotguns and rotary cannons dropping around the board. The biggest problem that the agents are likely to have is a lack of anti-tank support. I feel like some allied Imperial Knights would be quite good to bridge that gap a little bit. Either maybe some Armitor Warglaves or perhaps Canis Rex. At least that could give you a few units on the table that are pretty efficient when they shoot and charge enemy tough tanks and monsters. Finally for the Imperium, we've got the more divergent Space Marine chapters. The Blood Angels again are at maybe a slightly awkward place for making this video, given that they've got a codex that's on the way quite shortly. They haven't yet had the formal announcement of their combat patrol, but until then it seems at least reasonable that you could plan around the Blood Angels army set. Given the contents of it, I'd guess it's probably going to cost somewhere around the $250 mark, and that gets you Lamatis and Astarath, the jump chaplains, a whole bunch of jump intercessors and on-foot intercessors that you could either field as Death Company or regular ones, and a Brutalis Dreadnought that you could field as a Death Company Dread. That does actually already give you really quite a lot of points on the table. And like most of the rest of the armies, that budget's in the codex as well. And then to round that up to 1,000 points for a bit of support, I've also gone for a Scout Squad and a Gladiator Lancer. Putting that together, again these are really quite rough numbers pre-codex, but going by rough things from the Sons of Sanguinius currently, that'd give us a whole load of very punchy Space Marines with +2 strength and +1 attack on the charge, and that pretty fearsome Red Rampage stratagem. For this one, we've got each one of the Death Company chaplains leading a small unit of Jump Death Company, each with an Eviscerator. They likely won't be quite as fearsome as when you had the Power Fist versions for them, but they should still both leave a mark with the chaplains around, and particularly with any buffs like Red Rampage. For skirmishing in the midfield, there's 2 units of 5 Assault Intercessors, each with a Power Fist, and a couple of units of Scouts. They can maybe start on mid-board objectives, or perhaps think about using their Return to Reserves thing if they need to do a bit of secondary support. Then we've got the big stompy and fearsome Brutalis Dreadnought with the Talons. Depending on what the datasheet looks like, we can either field it as a Death Company 1 or not as a Death Company 1. Will be interesting to see how they stack up against each other. And then finally, just for a token bit of dedicated anti-tank firepower, we've got the Gladiator Lancer. Again, like the Space Marine list, just quite an easy include to give you something that can reliably break the toughest vehicles that the enemy has to offer. And often just having a little bit of high power ranged firepower is really nice to support an assault army. For more ideas for expanding, I feel like you certainly would want some jump intercessors for Blood Angels, at least with how the points stand at the moment. At 80 points, with their skirmish profiles that are already pretty great in most Space Marine chapters, but in Sons of Sanguinius they're really next level, being a good melee threat in their own right as well. That'll give you some red jump packs to be jumping alongside the black ones. Perhaps to transport the Assault Intercessors into battle, an Impulsor could be a reasonable one to pick up. They're quite popular at the moment, maybe with a captain to lead the Assault Intercessors in the future and have them deployed out of the Primaris transport. And then maybe for a little bit of home objective holding, you could pick up some Infiltrators. They've got some deep strike denial to stop enemies dropping on your home field and taking that, while the rest of the army is no doubt gone bounding up the board. Moving on to some other angry close combat Space Marines. Next up we've got the Black Templars. For this one we've gone for the Combat Patrol. Then we've got High Marshal Helbrecht himself to lead a unit of Sword Brethren, a big chunky flame tank in a Land Raider Redeemer, and again we've gone for a Scout Squad in support. For this one the numbers didn't fit enormously neatly, so in this one we have one of the Scout Squads that's present on the board and the other one's left out. For the army list we're going for the themed Black Templar detachment with Righteous Crusaders. This one often people use to get the 6+ Feel No Pain at the start of the game, and then they can flex into other vows as needed, and have some nice combat support including extra AP and the chance to lock enemies in close combat, which can be really brutal. For perhaps the biggest and scariest threat in the list, we've got High Marshal Helbrecht, who'll lead a squad of Sword Brethren. They'll be actually taking the Impulsor into battle rather than the Land Raider. It's got 6 transport slots for them, and they'll hopefully try and use that to get into a safe place in the midboard, and then use that as a staging bunker to jump out of and charge. Between them, these guys can handle most threats in the game in a single round of combat if they have buffs. The +1 damage that the Sword Brethren give Helbrecht is kind of big, as is his buff for them. Otherwise, we've got a Black Templar Marshal who'll be leading the Crusader squad. The Crusader squad will be spec'd for melee with as many chainswords as possible and the Power Fist, and they can hit with a pretty obscene amount of attacks in close combat. They're quite good users of the extra AP stratagem as well. The Land Raider itself is a big threat too. It's very hard to take down, particularly with Armour of Contempt, and can be a massive threat for Overwatch in the midfield, but can just mean that you can charge a really long way out of it. It moves forward, drops the unit, and then they get into combat, hopefully on a midfield objective where they've got all of that objective control. Then again, for just a little bit of screening, we've got a scout squad for the midboard, good for objectives, grunt work and secondaries and things, and then the combat patrol also comes with a unit of intercessors as well. For this one, they'll be tasked with holding the home objective. Potentially, if it makes sense to, they could mark it with their sticky objective rule and then move up to join the fight if you think the opponent's army isn't going to have some way of getting around behind you and stealing it. Otherwise, for ideas for expanding, the Emperor's Champion is a pretty common staple in Black Templars list. He's really quite cheap and very fighty for the cost, plus if you're playing Black Templars, you might kind of want one of them anyway. Maybe a Redemptor Dreadnought could be a nice choice just for some all-round muscle. Very tough with its -1 damage and providing a little bit of fire support as well. And I'd be kind of tempted by Castellan or Lieutenant to join the Crusader squad to give them lethal hits at base. That way they're just a lot more of a threat to tougher stuff without having to spend stratagems on it. Moving on, we've got the Space Wolves. For most armies, I've chosen to build around the combat patrol, but for the Space Wolves I opted not to. It's not an awful choice, it does get you some sculpted upgrade sprues, the unique battle leader, and the Reavers that you can field as Hounds of Morkai, but I feel like for the way that Space Wolves often want to play, it just felt more tempting for going for a bunch of their themed units, though I would bear in mind that this got some pros and cons. It has made this starter army a lot more expensive at nearly $500, plus again, like with the Grey Knights, there's a pretty reasonable chance that a lot of this might either get Primaris updates or sent to Legends in the not too distant future. As ever with Games Workshop, we don't 100% know on that front though. In any case, talking through the units, the force is headed up by the Mighty Dreadnought Beyond the Fell-Handed. He's $62, and there's 2 sets of Thunderwolf Cavalry and a Wolf Lord on Thunderwolf to lead them. 2 sets of the Space Marines but Werewolf Wolfen units, 1 set of Blood Claws for some battle line troops to hold some objectives, and 1 squad of Primaris Infiltrators to field as 2 separate squads of 5, perhaps 1 to hold the home objective and 1 to infiltrate into the midfield. Hopefully they could borrow a few Space Wolf type bits from the Blood Claws perhaps, just to give them a little bit more theme than they'd have otherwise. All of that clocks in at just under $500 at $487. For their detachment, for this one I chose to build around the Champions of Ross. Quite a lot of Space Wolf lists like to run Stormlance at the moment, though I feel like you have to go ridiculously heavy on the Thunderwolves if you're going to do that. I do quite like it now the Champions of Ross is actually good enough to compete with that, getting one of your sagas active turn 1, and then hopefully one of the characters will be able to trigger at least one of the rest as the game progresses. It could be good to start with the Feel No Pain, and then get one of the melee buffs if you can pick it up from destroying enemy units. In any case, for this one we've got Bjorn the Fell-Handed with a Las Cannon, and a Wolf Lord on Thunderwolf. He's going to be leading up a squad of 6 Thunderwolves equipped with the Storm Shields, and that just makes them into a very general purpose, all-round, fast, tanky and dangerous unit, particularly with the +1 damage that the Thunderwolves get also conferring to the Wolf Lord. So he effectively gets a +1 damage on the charge and a damage 3 melee weapon. There's 10 Blood Claws to skirmish in the midfield. The kit does give you enough to field a squad of 16 of them, so you'd have a few of them left over. The Wolfen take their hammers and shields, as that way they're a lot more dangerous with damage to attacks, and a 4+ invulnerable save means that they've got really quite good stats for their cost. The one thing that they don't do is objectives, as they're OC0, and then as mentioned 2 units of supporting infiltrators to do a little bit of grunt work, take the midboard with 1 squad and hold the home objective with another and deny deep strike nearby. There'll be loads of options for expanding the army, particularly with the vast amount of Space Marine units to draw on. Logan Grimnar, the Great Wolf himself, could be a fun option. Currently you can field him in Storm Rider, and he'd be a pretty powerful option to lead off a Thunderwolf cavalry squad, and he gives you a big turn of combat rerolls. I'd be quite tempted by some jump intercessors to field as Sky Claws. They're just all round efficient and good for secondary objectives and can still skirmish really hard with enemy lighter infantry. I'd be tempted to get a wolf-mounted battle leader, which I'd convert from a regular unit of Thunderwolves. Just use some of the fanciest bits that you've got left over from other things and do any conversions that you'd like. And given that Space Wolves only have the one Primaris model at the moment, might be worth picking up Ragnar Blackmane. His sculpt I think is quite a fun one, and he could be an option for leading the Blood Claws in this particular army. He can hand out a pretty big bucket load of mid-strength AP3 damage 2 attacks. Moving on to their bitter rivals, and next up we have the Dark Angels. They had a good chunk of their range refreshed earlier in the year, and for their example army I decided to go for Azrael, with his new miniature that came out in Arks of Omen. Some of the new Deathwing Knights for $70. I do like the way that Games Workshop's been cheeky with the box set and saying that there's 7 miniatures there, when one of them's the Watcher in the Dark and the other is the Teleport Homer. I went for 2 sets of the Fallen Dark Angels Inner Circle Companions, 1 set of Hellblasters, an Intercessor Squad and an Impulsor, going for a total of $444. Again for this one I didn't decide to build around the Combat Patrol box set. I genuinely think it's not awful for the price of it, but like the Space Wolf one, it just really lacks Dark Angel's theme, and it has that particularly unhelpful Gravis Captain that can't join any of the units there. I think if I were collecting Dark Angels from a standing start, I'd be tempted to focus on the Deathwing Terminators and do that before things like Aggressors. Putting that together, if I were starting Dark Angels currently, I would probably run them with Gladius Task Force. Unfortunately, it just doesn't look like Games Workshop have balanced the Codex attachments for Dark Angels very well against it, though Inner Circle Task Force would be the way that I'd go if I was going to try and make one of them work. Gladius is nice for Dark Angels though. The Advance and Charge and the melee damage boost stratagem that it offers are pretty great for Deathwing Knights and Inner Circle Companions. Plus you can do things like Fire Discipline combos with Hellblasters. For this army, we've got Azrael, who's pretty much auto-include for Dark Angels right now. I do think his miniature's pretty nice as well. He generates command points, gives a unit an invulnerable save, and gives you sustained hits. You could either field him with the Hellblasters here for a tankier and more dangerous unit, or have them run without him and just hang around with the Intercessors, maybe stay safe until late game, and move up to the mid-board to contest objectives later. Otherwise, I equip the Deathwing Knights with maces. I do quite like the way that they're just very general purpose and melee capable now. Some of the toughest Terminators in the game as well. You need a damage 5 attack to bring them down in one hit, which is kind of mad. The Inner Circle Companions are put together in one big unit and they'll ride in the Impulsor. In theory, Azrael could join them and I feel like that wouldn't be a wrong choice. I do really like his invulnerable save and the sustained hits, but he also can't farm command points while he's in a transport as well, so that is one negative. For this one I've given the Impulsor a shield dome, though I happily could have taken the missile launcher as an alternative. Then we've got the 10 Hellblasters as a big general purpose threat. They're one of the more efficient Space Marine units for picking up in terms of getting points per the money, so are quite good for newer players. Plus I feel like they're a unit that's just hard to go wrong with, very nasty against enemy elite infantry, and the fire on death thing means they're just quite forgiving when you use them, means that you get a lot of damage out of them even if they die. And then there's 2 Intercessor units to hold objectives. One will hopefully try and put their sticky objective rule on the home objective, and the other one can be some higher objective control, expendable skirmishing things in the midfield. For this army I'd likely try and rapid ingress the Deathwing Knights, hopefully have them drop down turn 2 somewhere safe, and then step up to put the smack down in your following turn. As ever, absolutely loads of ways that you could expand the Dark Angels after this. At some point I certainly would be tempted to pick up the Primarch himself, Lionel Johnson. Really quite a fun miniature I think. He's genuinely fairly scary in game after they updated his points cost, and again might not be the worst choice for getting points on the table quickly. The Primarchs are strangely enough one of the best ways that you can get loads of points in your army without spending too much. Otherwise, also on that front, I'd be tempted to get some more Deathwing, either more Deathwing Knights or potentially just a more regular Deathwing Terminator squad. Again, a good amount of chunky elites on the table for the money. And for the Gladius Task Force, I'd be tempted to add in a Space Marine Lieutenant to use Fire Discipline. He could run with the Hellblasters and turn them from just a fairly good shooting threat into an absolutely apocalyptically dangerous one. Sticking with the Heretic Astartes, and next up we've got the Chaos Space Marines. For their army I decided to go around Combat Patrol Chaos Space Marines for $168, and then added to that I've got 1 Chaos Lord, a Chaos Rhino and a Chaos Vindicator, and a Forge Fiend. I have gone at least fairly heavy on the Chaos Armour here. Overall these would come to $422. Putting that all together, I've chosen to use the Renegade Raiders detachment, given that it's just one of the easiest to use and most general purpose Chaos armies. You get to advance and shoot with your units, and get extra AP against things on objectives, which is pretty nasty in combination with Dark Pacts, and can make you a seriously fast moving and hard hitting damage dealer force. From the combat patrol, we've got one Master of Possession leading a squad of 5 possessed. Fairly solid fast moving units to skirmish in the midboard. I feel like the Master of Possession doesn't maybe add tons to the units, though I do think his model is pretty fun. Then also joining them going forward will be a Chaos Lord accompanying one of the sets of Legionaries in the Chaos Rhino. He might not have quite enough bits for absolutely optimal squads, but taking maximal heavy melee weapons, maybe one squad with a plasma gun and one with a melter gun, and probably taking chainswords over bolters for a nice bit of melee with a bit of AP on objectives. Their reroll wound rolls can be really nasty against things in the midfield, particularly on the turn where the Chaos Lord goes into rage mode and gets massive boost to his stats. Renegade Raiders getting access to a AP reduction stratagem is kind of handy as well, could be another option for the Chaos Lord's free stratagem use. Otherwise, we've got a unit of Chaos Cultists that will put sticky objectives on the home field and then hopefully move up into the mid-board to contest things there. They can be some expendable cannon fodder, and then to take down enemy elites at a distance, we've got one Chaos Vindicator with its enormously hard-hitting cannon. That will likely be making some very good use of the sustained hits and the assault keyword. And then we've got a Forge Fiend with triple ectoplasma cannon. He might be tempted to guard the home objective, but it's just generally a very dangerous unit with access to devastating wounds, and those cannons have got enough strength to deal with light vehicles and also get multiple copies of blast, so they can be surprisingly punchy against hordes as well. Hopefully should be a fairly balanced chaos list, a bit of melee and a good bit of ranged firepower. For a few options to expand, Abaddon the Despoiler, kind of like Lionel Johnson, wouldn't be the worst for getting a bunch of points on the board. It's maybe a bit of a big commitment though, and a lot of lists might want to run him with Terminators too. They do cost a lot of points, but again that could help you get towards their 2000 point army list a little bit faster. For another option for things moving into the mid-board, Chaos Chosen could be a good unit to go with a Chaos Lord as well. They might be competing with the Legionaries for space in the Rhino, but they are quite fun-threatening models and quite recent sculpts as well. If you wanted yet more fire support, perhaps a Chaos Predator could be interesting. I'd be tempted by the Destructor pattern with some las cannon sponsons with the ways that the rules work currently, though you certainly could magnetise. And otherwise there is one small sort of discount set in the Warp Forged set for Chaos Space Marines. That one gets you 2 Obliterators and a Venom Crawler at a fairly reasonable price, a bit better than you might expect for Games Workshop vehicles and things. Again, they tend to be one of the better sources of points per the money, though the Obliterators are perhaps a bit overcosted for use in game at the moment. Next up for the Legion of Magnus, we've got the Thousand Sons. For these guys, I have chosen to start with the often much maligned Combat Patrol, which is very Zangor heavy. I certainly feel like it's not the perfect combat patrol for them. I see it more as the way to build out a good bunch of chaff to the army to go alongside the Space Marines, as opposed to being the main event. You get Terminators and an Infernal Master in that, and then beyond that I've gone for a squad of Rubik Marines, some Exalted Sorcerers, and a Mutalith Vortex Beast. Thousand Sons tend to be at least a fairly economical army to collect. This is around about $385, so a bit less than some. Putting that into an army list, I've got a nice Sorcerer heavy core to the army, an Infernal Master who'll take the Arcane Vortex enhancement. He can be incredibly nasty and hard-hitting shooting there. One Exalted Sorcerer to go with the other squad of Rubik Marines, and then an Exalted Sorcerer on disc that will run solo. Still make some efficient Cabal points and can also slow a unit. The Rubik Marines are equipped with Warp Flamers as they're just nasty shooting up close with their rerolls to wound. I will take the Soul Reaper cannon as well. There's a squad of 5 Scarab Occult Terminators, which again I'd consider using Rapid Ingress to get them there, teleport them somewhere safe and then move up. 2 squads of Zangors for some high objective control chaff units to do objectives and actions, and then a Mutalith Vortex Beast to act as a centre point of the army. It can increase the range of Kabbalistic rituals like Doombolt, and also has a surprisingly scary shooting attack, as well as being kind of tough. For expanding the army and sticking with the big centrepiece models, Magnus the Red I think would be a pretty reasonable shout if you're expanding the army towards 2000 points. It's very rare to see a competitive list without him given how much use he is. It's just awesome in terms of his damage output, really fast, and just an excellent centre point for any of the Kabbalistic rituals and the stratagems that you can use on him. Otherwise, Ahriman with his 3 Kabbalistic rituals and his +1 to wound with a bunch of Warp Flamers is a very nice sorcerer choice if you're expanding them further. I'd say compared with the list to start with, I'd be most tempted to add more Rubik Marines to it to flesh out the core of the army a bit more. If you've got up to 20 of them, then maybe add in a Rhino to transport a couple of squads. They can be particularly nice, with an Infernal Master sniping out the top as they move up the board, and then get out to unleash some Warp Flame goodness. Next up we've got the World Eaters, and for them I went for the Combat Patrol. a Rhino to transport some Berserkers about, 1 extra squad of Jackals, and then 2 units of 8-bound. For around 1,000 points that comes to $411. Leading the force, you've got the choice between Lord Invocatus or a Lord on a Juggernaut. I'd probably go for Lord Invocatus out of those two, at least with the current rules. It's kind of fun to have him and a whole bunch of scary 8-bound scouting up the board if necessary, or at least getting into the best positions to strike next turn. People often like to just run him completely solo and not attach him to a unit, as he can be a fairly big melee threat in his own right. The Combat Patrol gets you a whole ton of Khorne Berserkers. I've chosen to field 1 unit of 10 of them and 2 units of 5, taking the heavy weapons and the plasma pistols that you're allowed. 10 of them will go in the Rhino to deliver them to the midboard, put a lot of objective control there, and hopefully threaten to blood surge into enemy troops if they try and take objectives against them. The others will have to foot slog and do their best to manage with terrain, hopefully with long charges from the World Eaters detachment, with a combination of advance and charge, automatic 6-inch advances, and the extra 2-inch movement on the go. They'll hopefully still be able to make melee. The Jackals will use their sticky objectives to mark the home field objective and potentially farm some blessings rerolls on there as well, and the other 10 will go towards the midfield. And then the 8-bound will hopefully try and get themselves in position with scouting, and then go for long charges against the enemy heavy hitters. I use 1 unit of regular 8-bound with the Sergeant with Lacerators, and 1 unit of Exalted 8-bound with the Chain Fists. They'll really have to be able to make sure that they can do good work against enemy heavies. There isn't really all that much good stuff for taking out tanks and monsters in this army. I feel like that might be a nature of the Combat Patrol though. You get a lot of stuff that's better against enemy infantry versus tough stuff, with all the Berserkers and Jackals and things. For expanding at the moment, World Eaters have got quite a small range. I feel like most World Eater players will be tempted to pick up Angron the Man himself. Really fun rules with being a big cornate meteor of destruction, leaping up the board and breaking things, plus quite a lot of points all in one go, even if he is a big pricey model. To lead the Khorne Berserkers, particularly in the Rhino, I think about Khan the Betrayer or a Master of Executions armed with the Berserker Glaive. I'd say both of them are nice enough for the points. Since the points increases though, they're a little bit less standout than they used to be. Otherwise maybe some more 8-bounds to be able to handle enemy tough stuff a bit better. Hopefully they'll get a few more fun options when their Codex comes out. Moving on to the Blighted Legion of the Death Guard. To make an army of Nurgle's Chosen, for them I decided to go with Combat Patrol Death Guard. Again, it's not really considered one of the good ones, mainly just due to its massive emphasis on Poxwalkers. Though again, like the Thousand Suns one, I don't feel like it's the worst pickup to have as one part of an 1,000 point list. It might be kind of overkill on the Horde infantry component, but I think Poxwalkers are still usable enough, and everything else is really quite strong at the moment. Otherwise, beyond that, I've gone for a Feated Bloat Drone, 2 sets of the very dangerous Death Shroud Terminators with their scythes, a Chaos Rhino once more, and a Chaos Predator for some fire support. This one's come in at one of the more pricey ones, partly due to all the points decreases that Death Guard got. It's $488 for this. To head up the army, we've got the characters from the Combat Patrol. Typhus is rather godly at the moment for the points cost, being a very dangerous fighty character and also belching out a massive amount of mortal wounds. He'll run with the Death Shroud Terminators here. A big unit of 6 of them that will ideally want to try and make combat by using rapid ingress, dropping down somewhere safe and then threatening a big charge. Then we've got the Biologist Putrefier with his big critical hit combo going with some Plague Marines in the Rhino. The Plague Marines will take some fairly maximal special weapons and the heavy plague weapons, and they can skirmish on the midboard with a few extra mortal wounds from the grenades that the Biologist Putrefier can bring. For the Poxwalkers, I've chosen to field them as 3 individual squads. They can be grunt units for actions and objectives and things, and are at least fairly tough for the points, even if they are very slow. One other option is that you could have Typhus lead a big unit of 20 of them, and have an unusual sort of horde unit making its way towards the midboard that's more dangerous than it'd normally be. Otherwise, we've got a Bloat Drone armed with a Flesh Mower, a nice cheap melee unit, though I feel like the heavy Plague Spitters could be a pretty reasonable choice as well. And finally, we've got a Predator Destructor, an Autocannon Turret and Las Cannon Sponsons that can get on quite well with the extra AP debuff that your units will put out with the Contagion Rangers. The autocannon can be very nasty when it gets to be an effective AP3 against heavy infantry. Hopefully that should be a reasonable enough balance. I feel like for expanding beyond there, I think that more Plague Marines would be kind of a reasonable choice. The kit that they have is maybe a bit of a frustrating one though. You only get 7 in the box, which is all very fluffy for Nurgle and everything, but is a bit annoying that you don't get the 10 of them that you might want to be able to make maximal use of transports and characters and things. To join the squad in the Rhino, I might be tempted to get a Foul Blight Spawn. They're nice with their Plagues Flamers and then the fairly nasty fights first. Combining that with Biologist Putrefier and you could have a very dangerous unit on a mid-board objective. Finally, I thought I'd mention Mortarion as well. Compared with Magnus or Angron, I don't feel like he's quite as must-take at the moment in terms of strong list for Death Guard. His model is rather spectacular though. I believe it's one of Games Workshop's best-selling of all time, and could be a nice centrepiece of the collection to work up to. It's useful enough in-game as well, obviously very tanky, and a nice anchor to the force, even if he isn't quite as massively destructive as his brother demon Primarchs. Next up, for the Legions of the Dark Gods themselves, we've got the Chaos Demons. Given the deities, you could collect them basically 4 different ways, maybe going for a mono-god army if that's what you'd like to, or having a full mix of Chaos Undivided. At the moment at least, Combat Patrol Chaos Demons is a corn-flavoured one. You do get quite a lot of models and points in the box for that, so I've started with that, and beyond that in support we've got Plague Bearers and Nurglings to do a bit of holding up the enemy, and then leading the force is a mighty Bloodthirster of Khorne to add a serious bit of massive destruction. Between all that comes to $415. Putting that into an army list, we've got a Bloodthirster leading the way with the Great Axe. That's generally considered the way to go on the damage front, and he'll be backing that up with Argath, the King of Blades, the enhancement, making it even more dangerous. With the latest rules for Chaos Demons in the balanced data slate, the Bloodthirster can also be the delivery mechanism of the other Khorne 8 units. You can have them deep strike right next to them, and then make a very close deep strike charge, re-rolling with instruments, so that would be the way that at least some of the Bloodletters will be looking to get there, and they can still be very nasty in close combat themselves. Otherwise, the Fleshhounds can be running around doing secondaries and skirmishing with enemies over objectives, not quite as much a threat to enemy elites. The Blood Crushers could be another deep strike threat, or move up the board on foot. 10 Plague Bearers can be used to hold some objectives, and Nurglings will give you the option to put something in the midboard, do a bit of screening and holding up the enemy, and potentially helping out with certain secondaries, even if they can't do actions anymore. With this one you still have the Khorne Herald on foot left over from the Combat Patrol as well, just didn't really fit too neatly into the points for this one. For some ideas for expanding, another fun and commonly used unit for demons are Flamers of Tzeentch if you did want to add a third deity into the mix. They're just quite nice that they do have some alright range damage output, and that's pretty useful with all the deep striking shenanigans that demons can get up to. Quite a nice choice for the 3-inch drop, and they can have some interesting options for Overwatch too. Quite a popular choice in most lists at the moment is the Great Unclean one. They've just made a ridiculously tanky unit with him. He's only 230 points, and he can take the enhancement that gives him a 4+ Feel No Pain, basically meaning that if the opponent attacks him, then you're pretty much winning out whenever that happens. Just have him stomp up the board and bully things on the midfield objectives. And I might be tempted to round up that Blood Crusher squad to a big 6 of them, and that'll give you a massively dangerous threat to have coming out of Deep Strike for the Bloodthirster to deliver. Certainly loads of options beyond that. Most of the greater demons are seriously scary right now, and loads of the other units are far better than they used to be. Finally, for the ranks of Chaos, we've got the Chaos Knights. I've gone for a bit of a mirror for the Imperial ones for this one, getting the Knight Abominant kit, which makes the themed Chaos Knights, and then 2 sets of 2 War Dogs. Again, it comes in as one of the cheaper options for 40k armies at 1000 points. This one would be $383. As with the Imperials, the Knights can often be a little bit tricky to make fit into any one points value. Sometimes you can help out by rounding things up with some Nurglings. For this one though, I went for a Knight Rampager for the build for the Abhorrent class. To be honest though, I'd be very tempted to magnetize so you could field it as multiple different things. And then with the way things are at the moment, I've gone for 2 Wardog Brigands with Havoc launchers, nice powerful shooting gun turrets that move very fast, and also have quite a lot of objective control as well, and then 2 very savage and fast moving Wardog Carnivores, the brutal melee version of the War Dogs, and they can be quite nice just to be rushing up the board and getting all that dread range out as fast as possible. They're a good choice for the walk through wall style stratagem as well, getting charges that they might not otherwise be able to do reliably. For the top carapace weapons for all those, I've chosen Havoc launchers. It's just helpful to be able to stack a bit of indirect fire on something that you can't see, and between 4 of them you might have a semi-reliable chance of putting some wounds on some light infantry or something. For options for expanding, there aren't really a load of different ways to go. If we're mainly sticking to the core index for Chaos Knights, then probably a few more War Dogs wouldn't be the worst idea. Generally they've been the strongest units of Chaos Knights for a good long time now, to the extent where you often get people running entire armies of basically nothing but at competitive events, even if that's not the way that most people like to collect Chaos Knights. I'd probably go for another Abhorrent class as well, ideally magnetised. It might be a bit of personal preference as to whether or not you want to get one of the standard Loyalist Questores kits and run that as a despoiler, or go for another one and have options for fielding an Abominant or a Desecrator. The Abominant isn't the most strong right now though. You could get a Knight Tyrant for a bit of dedicated fire support, unfortunately not really the most well costed currently. The Loyalist one does have it significantly beat with the rerolls that they get built in, and otherwise you could think about Allied Demons. I think it wouldn't be the worst idea to expand to some, but I would bear in mind that Allied rules in 40k tend to change far more than the core codex. The best units that you can run might change quite a bit, or even just be flat out banned. I'd focus on the core army a fair bit before building out to Allied Demons in a big way. Next up we've got the Xenos armies, and first up we have the Aeldari. For 40k Space Elves, I've started out with Combat Patrol Aeldari, the one with the Wraith Knight and the jet bikes, and then for other things to support them I've gone for one squad of Swooping Hawks, a support weapon, and then gone for a big high investment model in the Avatar of Cain. Maybe a bit of an unusually big scary model for smaller games, but also one that does get a lot of points on the table and is fairly easy to use. Going with this collection, it looks like that comes out to be one of the cheaper options for armies so far, at $362. Maybe the other thing that might be a bit questionable on this list are the Swooping Hawks. I wouldn't be too surprised if they get a model update in the not too distant future, but given Games Workshop we don't know when that'll be. In any case though, if we did go for those, then we've got the Farseer on foot. He'd be useful for giving -1 to wounds on either the Wraith Lord or more likely the Avatar of Cain, giving you a big tough strong central unit to move up the mid-board and bully. And he could also be useful for feeding in automatic 6s with Fate dice, maybe into the support weapon D cannon, getting some automatic devastating wounds on a key target. Escorting the Farseer, I've chosen to use the Guardians as Guardian Defenders here with a Bright Lance platform. In general, the Bright Lances often tend to be the best heavy weapons that you can go for, given the Battle Host rerolls that Aeldari get at the moment. Rerolling 1 hit and 1 wound makes them ridiculously reliable anti-tank. The Guardian Defenders would likely be aiming to tag a home field objective and generate some Fate dice each turn while plinking away shots with the big gun. Though I wouldn't have been entirely against going Storm Guardians, their sticky objectives rule is quite nice, and they get a little bit of extra tankiness with the Serpent Scale platform. Otherwise we've got a unit of 6 Wind Riders, they've got Shuriken Cannons, and perhaps could be an option to fire and fade with if it made sense, hitting the enemy and then retreating safe behind terrain from reprisals. The unit of Swooping Hawks is rather good in Pariah Nexus action type missions, being able to jump around the board doing secondary objectives and still having some good volume fire to take out light stuff. And for the Wraith Lord I've gone for a Bright Lance Star Cannon, Ghostglaive and Flamers. I believe that you don't get 2 Bright Lances in the kit, which would probably be the optimal loadout. But in any case, hopefully between him and the Avatar, the enemy will have too many big scary things to be able to take down too efficiently. For a few ideas for expanding, Autarch Wayleapers are really quite popular at the moment. They're the lone operative version of the Autarch who can move around the board quite quickly. Just being able to rustle up command points and then do lone operative things like screening and objectives without being able to be shot is handy, and they can skirmish okay with lighter infantry as well in a pinch towards the end of the game. Maybe a Warwalker or 2 could be nice for adding a bit more dedicated long-range anti-tank. I feel like they're really going to be an awful choice for Aeldari. And perhaps for a unit to hold the mid-board, the Kill Team Striking Scorpions box set could be handy. You get a reasonable amount of Aspect Warriors for the price compared with some there. They can be pretty savage on the charge, and screening infiltrate units are just handy to have, stopping the enemy moving up quite as safely and being in the position to do early game objectives and secondaries. At the moment I feel like there's quite a lot of different ways that you could go with Aeldari though. After having a lot of nerfs, I feel like plenty of their units are in the usable but not necessarily auto-include sort of category. Moving on, we've got their Dark Kin in the Drukhari. I've started out with their Combat Patrol, which I would rate as one of the very best in Warhammer 40k at the moment. I feel like perhaps the boring answer to building the army list is that you could have just taken 2 Combat Patrols as a starting point. Definitely could be an option for expansion, but for this army I've gone for a bit more of a mix, getting a Venom, a squad of Witches, Lilith Hesperax, and budgeting for a unit of the Mandrake's Kill Team, which currently isn't released yet, but should be kind of soon. They've been expected for an individual release for quite some time now. Finally we've got a unit of the Winged Scourges for $37, and putting that all together it's $407. Not the cheapest of them, but also not the most expensive either. For the army we're taking the Sky Splinter Assault Force. That's their new detachment that they got in the Balanced Data Slate update in January. Massive great big threatening buffs for things jumping out of transports as their preferred way of war, and particularly scary long charges with things like Witches or Incubi, of which we have both here. Leading the force we have an Archon with the Nightmare Shroud. He'll be going with the unit of Incubi. and he'll be taking a ride in the Venom. The Nightmare Shroud will stop him being overwatched, and they are just a pretty blendy, scary melee unit. They can also ruin enemy command points as well. Then we've basically got the same trick with Lilith Hesperex and a unit of the 10 Witches in the Raider, another very scary long charge threat that gets rather good against most targets with Lance and a Pain token. Then we've got a squad of Cabalite Warriors, which are unfortunately foot slogging in this army. I feel like expanding to get another Raider or more Venoms for them could be a reasonable idea. For the Scourges, you get a mix of weapons in the kit. I'd probably just count them as Dark Lances, though otherwise many just focus on the big heavy hitting ones that can take down tanks and vehicles. They'd be supported by the Ravager, which again is equipped with Dark Lances for some more long-range anti-tank fire, and then there's 2 units of 5 Mandrakes, which again are just excellent to have in the mid-board. Nice cheap skirmishing infiltrators at the start of the game, and then they've got that nice fade-away type rule to have them appearing around the board. Would usually make sense to have one of them doing that and do some tactical secondary objectives. Otherwise, for expanding the army, the Drukhari still are a little bit hamstrung by having a few of their kits out of production right now. At present though, I really think another combat patrol could be a very easy way to go. Literally all the units in it are ones that you could very reasonably run in multiples, and compared with plenty of other combat patrols out there, you just get a bit more stuff than some. For another one of their recent sculpts, you could maybe pick up Drazar to lead another squad of Incubi if you'd like. He's quite a fun model and fairly destructive. And if you wanted to add a bit of representation for the Homunculus Covens, then maybe a Talos or Kronos kit could be nice. A lot of competitive lists like to use exactly one Kronos for a bit of pain token support, though I feel like you reasonably could run more if you wanted to. They are kind of ridiculously tanky for the points, even if they don't do masses of damage. Moving on, we've got the start of the show of 10th edition with Tyranids. For their army, I thought we'd start out with the 40k starter set, which I have included at the full price here, though again, realistically you'd want to try and split that with a Space Marine player, so hopefully it should be half of that value. If you could just pick up a box half of Leviathan though, that'd probably be what I'd go for and build from there. Otherwise though, to build out that starter set half to 1000 points, I've gone for a Hive Tyrant, a Tyrannifex for a big gun at the backfield, an Exocrine box, and the spooky infiltrating leader that is Death Leaper. That'll bring us to a total of $386, though as mentioned you do get some bonus Space Marines in that. For putting the Tyranids on the board, in a basic starter army, I've gone for an Invasion Fleet detachment. That's the one with the hyper adaptations that can make you better against either infantry, monsters and vehicles, or in theory characters, though I probably wouldn't go for that one. Plus it's got the fairly nice Feel No Pain stratagem that you probably want to use every turn, and the Hive Tyrant can give that to the unit that's been threatened the most each turn for free. The Hive Tyrant to be leading the list, he's got a Venom Cannon and the Bone Sword. Quite scary that it can keep these stratagems coming both in your turn and the enemy's, and his Onslaught aura means that you can advance and shoot with things, which will be pretty handy for both the Exocrine and the Tyrannifex in this list. They can be a Tyranid monstrous gun battery there, some scary anti-elite bioplasma from the Exocrine, and a scary anti-tank shot from the Tyrannifex's Rupture Cannon. Otherwise, we've got Death Leaper being a spooky scary lictor in the midboard, maybe triggering a few more battle shock tests if the enemy units have taken damage. A Winged Prime can be bounding around the board doing secondary things. He maybe isn't the best fit with this list given that he doesn't have anything to lead. He is quite a fun model though. Then we've got 2 sets of 10 Termagants for putting some cheap objective control on the midboard points. 2 individual Ripper Swarms that could help out with certain secondaries like engaged on all fronts or behind enemy lines. 1 set of 3 Von Ryan's Leapers for a little bit more fight first threat on the midboard objectives, and a Psychophage that could potentially hang around with the monsters, a cheap monstrous creature and another source of Feel No Pain. It might be a good idea to play a bit weirdly aggressive with that guy and have him tank a fair bit of damage if he gets hit at a distraction card effects. He isn't really the most threat in the world though. Otherwise, for expanding further, plenty of interesting other ways that you can go. Perhaps the counterpart of the Exocrine in the Haruspex could be interesting enough. Basically a great big maw of a Tyranid beast and a fairly easy unit to use. Basically moves forward and hits the enemy very hard in close combat. A Maleceptor could be another interesting frontline bug. He is the Alpha Tyranid Synapse organism. Having at least 1 unit of gargoyles isn't usually the worst idea. They can move, shoot, move and reach interesting places on the board, and could be an option for the Winged Prime to lead if you wanted to make sure that he was included in an army. And finally, a Neurotyrant is a really popular choice in competitive lists, ideally from eBay or a Leviathan box half if you can. You can get the set with him and the Screamer Killer, though at least in 10th edition he's tended to be cheaper second hand. He can potentially sit at the back and guard the home objective for a little bit until his Shadow of the Warp buff is done, then maybe play a little bit more aggressive and maybe use his good torrent attack and some overwatch perhaps. Moving on, we've got the cultist followers of the Tyranids in the Genestealer Cults, and they're an army that got significantly more expensive to play after their previous combat patrol box was phased out. As a result, the particular starter army that I went for is a bit over $500, a combat patrol Genestealer Cult, the Brood Coven kit with the Magus, Primus and Patriarch in, quite a good one to get early I think, given it's some of the most iconic leaders, 2 sets of Neophytes for some Horde infantry, a Biophagus Twisted Mad Scientist, 1 Goliath truck for a bit of transport and some pure strain Genestealers. Putting that all together in just one example starter army, I've gone for the Host of Ascension, perhaps one of the most general purpose if you're not skewing the army towards any one style of units. This is the one where you get the ignores cover and the sustained hits when you come out of reserve, and I feel like it got quite a nice boost recently now Cold Ambush was changed. It's quite a big advantage that slain units can come back via normal deep strike, which is certainly good for things like neophytes with a bunch of heavy weapons jumping back in and making their presence felt with some mining weapons. Leading the army, we've got the Patriarch, who's been packed up by a big unit of 10 pure strain Genestealers. They'll be a scary threat to park in the midboard with a massive flurry of attacks with devastating wounds, ideally starting somewhere hidden out of sight and ready to either be aggressive or just make the enemy think twice about pushing units up that could get blended by them. Then for one of the biggest damage blocks in the list, there's a Primus with a chink in their armour. He'll go with the Neophyte squad, which is taking max seismic cannons, mining lasers, webbers and grenade launchers, and they'll be a scary deep strike threat, jumping onto the table with all the nasty boosts, using the stratagem to get critical hits on a 5+, and between all of those weapon profiles you'll get a lot of sustained hits and lethal hits with the Primus's rerolls. Should be a unit that can take out a lot of scary enemy threats, and not a bad Overwatch choice either, given the rerolls to hit that the Primus has. Then for some threat on the board, we've got a Biophagus leading a unit of 10 Acolytes with auto pistols moving forward in a Goliath truck. The auto pistol version are the ones with the scary mining weapons, and the truck should be able to move up and be a battlefield bunker to assault out of, hopefully being a nasty melee threat to the central objectives, and they've got sticky objectives as their rule too. There's units of Jackals and a Jackal Alphas to skirmish for the midboard. You get them in the combat patrol. I wouldn't say that the Alphas is a particularly strong character, but she does have a fun sniper rifle. And then finally we've got an Achilles Ridge Runner, either using the heavy mining laser if you want some direct damage, or you could go the mortar, which quite a lot of competitive lists like to do, maybe just sat on a home field objective and handing out the AP debuff, which is really nasty for the neophyte shooting or the acolytes melee. For some ideas for expanding the army, Kellamorphs are at least fairly popular at the moment now their pistols actually have some good threat. They're quite a fun lone operative that's hard to catch up to with reactive moves. Hybrid Metamorphs could be a fun option if you want a little bit more dedicated melee. They've got a fun surge move mechanic that can make them difficult to deal with on midfield objectives, potentially just stepping up and getting into combat with the enemy troops when they're shot. And otherwise you could scour the internet to see whether there's any on sale versions of either the old Combat Patrol box set, the one with the Rock Grinder and the Aberrants, or the Biosanctic Brood Surge Battle Force box set. If you can get either of those at a price that's fairly similar to what they came out with, they're quite good ways to get a good chunk of reinforcements towards the faction. Though as they're not on sale from Games Workshop directly anymore, it's not quite as easy to be super reliable about picking them up. Moving on to the Space Dwarves, and for the Leagues of Votann, again we've started out with the Combat Patrol. That's the one with the Khal, Hearthkin Warriors, Hernkin Pioneers, and the Chthonian Berserks. To beat that at, to an 1,000 point army, I've gone with basically one copy of a bunch of their other units. It's not like they have an enormous range at the moment. One unit of the Elite Einherjar Hearthguard, one Einherjar Champion, a Sagittor Transport, a big mighty Hecaton Land Fortress for big armour and a big gun, and also planning on getting a squad of Hernkin Jaegers, the kill team sort of scout Votann unit in trench coats that hasn't currently released at time of recording, but given a new edition of Kill Team just around the corner, they won't be too far off. Putting that into an 1,000 point army list, the Index Votann detachment is the one that gets judgment tokens on 4 nominated targets, plus some pretty nice stratagems like a big one for sustained hits when shooting. They do have some powerful support options. The list is headed up by the Khal, who takes his Concussion Gauntlet and Vulcanite gun, and he'll be running with one half of the Hearthkin Warriors in the Sagittor, adding just a bit more threat to that unit as they move up the board and try and take some midfield objectives. The other half of the Hearthkin will be sitting on a home field objective, guarding it against all comers. The Sagittor takes some beam cannons for a little bit of anti-armour, and that can be used to scout up the board. Then for a big threat in Teleport Reserve, we've got the Einherjar Champion with a squad of Einherjar Hearthguard with a Teleport crest. They've taken Vulcanite once more for some mass mortal wounds and can be a nice option for the sustained hit stratagem. If they make a charge out of Deep Strike with the Iron Hair Champions rerolls, they've hopefully got the chance to double dip with a whole bunch of melee as well. The Hearthguard have taken the Concussion Gauntlets for damage too, and the champion has a Mass Hammer, which can really lay the smack down on vehicles. Otherwise, we've got that mighty Hecaton Land Fortress with the heavy SP Conversion Beamer, the Bolt Cannons and the Scanner for Ignore's cover. That's a nice general purpose big threat that's quite a good one for using Void Armor on with its 2+ save, and it'll be transporting the Chthonian Berserks into battle. So if the enemy does try to get too close to it, you can countercharge them with a whole bunch of the Berserks with a scary damage dealing power mauls. Then finally, for a little bit of objective support and screening, we've got one unit of 10 Hernkin Jaegers in the midboard. Having just a cheap infiltrating squad is rather nice. I think they're quite cheap for 10 models that are infiltrating centrally and can still do a bit of damage to enemy lighter infantry with plasma knives. Then finally we've got a unit of the scouting Hernkin Pioneers. Their autocannons make them quite a good general purpose troubleshooting unit and are quite good with the +1 to wound with judgment tokens. They should be able to get an important bit of firepower where they need to. Overall, I feel like that's not too bad as a balanced starter for a Leagues of Votann army list, having a fair bit of different elements of the army. For expanding from there, as mentioned, they don't have an enormous amount of different options. Probably another combat patrol wouldn't be the worst idea in the world. I think everything in there is something that you could conceivably want in multiples, and you could build the second Carl as Uthar the Destined if you wanted access to him. Otherwise, Brockhir Thunderkin are reasonable enough. I'd probably be tempted by the Graviton guns. They could be an option for transporting in a land fortress with some reroll wound rolls. It's hard to go too far wrong with multiple Sagittors and Leagues of Votann at the moment. Could be an option to transport the other half of the Hearthkin Warriors if you wanted to. And otherwise I feel like you probably want to keep at least some hobby budget in reserve for their Codex release in 10th edition, where they're almost certainly going to get some other interesting units. Next up we've got the Greenskins. The combat patrol for Orks is the Beast Snagger flavoured one. I have built around this one here, though I admit that it's going to be more helpful if you do want that kind of aesthetic in your army. They're the sort of more tribal savage Orks, with a big focus on killing beasties and riding swigs about. Some people absolutely love that. I do quite like the aesthetic myself, though a bit less helpful if you just want more standard boys with a bit more looted technology and mech creations. In any case though, to expand that to 1000 points, I've got a truck, a unit of Gretchen, 2 sets of Storm Boys, 1 kill rig and a beast boss on Squigosaur. So I've doubled down a little bit on going down the Beast Snagger way for this. Orcs don't tend to have enormously elite units though, and this one comes to really quite a pricey $540. In particular, that kill rig's really quite a pricey piece, even if the model's quite a fun centerpiece in my opinion. For this one, to keep it general purpose for Orcs, I've gone a Warhorde. That's basically the Codex version of the Index detachment. You get sustained hits 1 in melee, and with a lot of close combat in Orc armies, that's generally fairly easy to use, plus some nice stratagems like -1 to wound, which is really good for Squighog boys. The Squighog boys will definitely be a primary melee threat of the army. The beast boss on Squigosaur and 4 Squighog boys will be a pretty massive melee threat that the enemy can't ignore. The -1 to wound stratagem will be good on them moving up, and they can bully their way towards a midfield objective. Then the regular beast boss on foot will run with one of the units of Beast Snagger boys. One of those units can take the truck, and the other one can take the kill rig. Maybe it doesn't matter enormously which one does which there. Either way, they can bring a fair amount of volume greenskin attacks, and the beast boss themselves are a bit more dangerous against enemy tanks and vehicles with their devastating wounds as well, so it could be a good option for bringing those down. The kill rig's fairly scary for Overwatch 2 with an auto-hitting Whir Tower with D3 auto-hits at sort of las cannon kind of profile. Not too many armies have access to that on the Overwatch front. Finally, to make the Orcs a little bit more playable for objective purposes, there's a unit of 11 Gretchen who can sit on a home objective and hopefully farm some command points, and then 2 units of Storm Boys that can bounce around doing secondary objectives or just do pretty long charges on the enemy when it makes sense to. Hopefully that should be a fairly scary mix of greenskin melee at 1000 points, 3 major threats moving forward. For ideas for expanding, you certainly could take an Orc army in a number of different ways. You could go more Dread Mob or Looted Creations or Green Tide kind of focus if you wanted to. If you like the look of the big boss Ghazghkull Thraka himself, I feel like picking him up isn't the worst idea in the world. I think his miniature's quite fun, and as with the Loyalist Primarchs, he's one of the best points per money in the Orc army right now. The other one would be the absolutely enormous Stomper, that might be a little bit less of a good idea as something that you're starting out with really. Otherwise, some regular knobs to ride in trucks or battle wagons could be fun. Armed with power claws, they can really pack a punch, particularly led by a standard war boss on foot. At some point I'd be tempted to pick up some standard boys as well. They can do fun things like sticky objectives, and they are basically the core troops units for the Codex. Would make sense to have at least a few of them going forward. For the Dynasties of the Necrons, once again I've started out with the Combat Patrol, the one they redid for 10th edition with the Canoptek Doomstalker and the Scorpet Destroyers. From that I've also added the Hierotech Circle. That one's the Necron Kill Team set with the Cryptek plus a unit of Immortals, and weirdly enough it adds up to being a small discount deal for the Necrons, so not the worst thing to get when starting out. To run with the Combat Patrol Overlord, I've gone with a unit of Lich Guard as well for some Armoured Elite muscle. And then finally, maybe in a slightly brave purchase for a starter army, I've gone with the Void Dragon as well. Maybe slightly personal preference there, just as I think that the miniature is really quite awesome. Plus Catan just get a lot of points on the board and are generally fairly easy to use in game, even if it might be a bit of a big painting challenge. If you wanted to save money, then you could have gone for the Nightbringer or Deceiver, which gets you the same amount of points on the board, but for a significantly smaller and cheaper miniature, though I do have a little bit of apprehension that they'll get updated at some point in the future, even if admittedly it might not be for a while. In any case, that little lot comes to $420. For the army, I've chosen to run them as a Hypercrypt Legion, though I feel like an Awakened Dynasty could have been okay as well as a different option. Hypercrypt is kind of fun though, just with the Necrons teleporting on and off the board, allowing you to bounce around, getting shots on the enemy, or jumping around to objectives. The 3-inch Deep Strike Stratagem is particularly disruptive and could be quite good for getting some close range shooting off if you wanted to. In any case, for this list, we've got the Overlord heading up the squad of Lich Guard with the Hyperphase Blades and Dispersion Shield, and he'll take the loadout that he gets from the Combat Patrol with the Tachyon Arrow. Should be at least a fairly tanky unit to battle for the midboard and hopefully survive with a bit of reanimation. The Technomancer for this one will head up the unit of Necron Warriors, probably not the absolute strongest unit in the world, but it makes use of both models. Again, hopefully it should just be a little bit chunkier than they would otherwise be with the Feel No Pains on the go, and try and survive to do a bit of reanimation as they score in the midboard. I've used the other bit of that Hierotech Circle to make death marks, and they can be warping around the board doing secondary objectives, maybe trying to claim the lives of some characters if there's something particularly good to snipe. Some Canoptek Scarabs can do a bit of skirmishing in the midboard, and they can still have a little bit of objective control if they go at least somewhere near the Technomancer. Quite a nice cheap distraction and disruption unit there. The Scorpet Destroyers will hopefully advance carefully behind cover, and then launch an assault if the enemy gets too close. They're pretty nasty against elites. The Doomstalker can be hovering in the background, laying down a bit of anti-elite fire, and if it doesn't have anything particularly good to shoot, you could think about using hyperphasing for it. Basically giving it the option to set up anywhere around any of the board edges that aren't screened, which hopefully should always mean that it's got some good choice of targets to keep the firepower coming. Finally, the Void Dragon will make its way towards a central objective, just being a really tanky unit to absorb a whole load of enemy firepower. You could potentially use hyperphasing to get him closer, with appearing on one of the board edges 9 inches from the enemy. Sometimes that might be the way to go, but otherwise he can just be a massive damage threat, particularly nasty against destroying enemy vehicles. For ideas for expanding the army, maybe getting some Canoptek Wraiths to pair with the Technomancer could be a pretty reasonable option. They certainly cost a bit more now, but they can be enormously tanky and hard to destroy. The Lone Operative Hexmark Destroyer is quite commonly taken as a support character, as he can drop in to do secondaries and maybe provide a little bit of infantry clearing fire support with his pistols, plus it's just a fun miniature with 6 pistols on the go. And maybe to add a little bit of dedicated anti-tank fire support, maybe Locust Heavy Destroyers could be a reasonable option. I feel like the current list is perhaps a little bit light on the anti-tank, at least in terms of guns, so I might be tempted by the Gauss, though the Enmitic weapons are pretty good if you just want more volume fire. Finally, for our look through the 40k armies, we've got the Tau Empire. For the Forces of the Greater Good, we've started out with the Combat Patrol, the one with the Pathfinders, Fire Warriors, Devilfish and Commander, quite a few core units there. And then in support of that, we've got a couple of units of stealth suits for some nice marking of targets, a Cadre Fireblades to lead the breaches in the Devilfish, a unit of Crisis Battlesuits to escort the Commander, and then finally a mighty Riptide Battlesuit and a Hammerhead tank to provide some devastating fire support. Tau really aren't too cheap in current 40k though. They've had quite a lot of points decreases over the edition, and even getting them to 1,000 points here with a fairly well-rounded army ran up to over $550 with this. For detachments for this army, I think I could fairly happily run either Montcar or Kauyon. It's probably not really a retaliation cadre list with fewer battlesuits than some. I went for Montcar for the advance and shoot and lethal hits if you're guided, plus a few fairly savage damage dealer stratagems. For the commander for this one, I've gone for a Cold Star commander with a fairly general purpose loadout, a missile pod, a cyclic ion blaster, a plasma rifle, and a high output burst cannon, and he'll be paired with the crisis suits, which I've chosen to run as the fire knife version with the missile pods, maybe opening up the shooting phase to quite good effect with the reroll hits. There's honestly quite a few ways that you could go with the crisis suits though. Both the Star Scythe and Sunforge are very usable indeed. Then we've got a Cadre Fireblade with a Breacher team, which will be loaded into the Devilfish. That's a very scary unit to be moving towards the midboard, then jump them out, guide them, and they get 4 rerolls to wound against their target. Montcart also has an AP boosting stratagem that can make them even more savage. These things can absolutely demolish infantry, and even take down battle tanks if they roll well. Then we've got a Pathfinder unit that can spot some other targets. They've taken grenade launchers and ion rifles, and can potentially help with marking targets, though certainly in Montcart they can be a big damage threat in their own right with lethal hits. Quite savage firepower for the points that you pay. Then the stealth team's a really nice marking support, reroll ones to hit and wound, plus just cheap units to screen the midfield if that makes more sense. The Riptide will likely play aggressively, taking the Ion Accelerator and the Fusion Blasters for being a pretty tanky unit with some nice anti-elite damage output. Being able to fall back and shoot is really quite a big deal for him being on the front lines as well. And then finally for some dedicated anti-armour, we've got a Hammerhead with a railgun and burst cannons to put some holes in enemy tanks at extreme range. I feel like for the Tau Empire, the vast majority of their units have at least some good use. Here's just a few examples for expanding beyond that. Commander Shadow Sun's a fast-moving and fairly threatening lone operative with some anti-tank firepower, which is nice, and if she can coordinate with a bit of firepower, the rerolls and command point farming are both good things. Piranhas are really good scouting screening vehicles, good for doing secondaries and holding up the enemy early game. They can fire off a barrage of Seeker missiles at the start as well, so pretty good things to hold up the enemy while the rest of the force is busy bringing its guns to bear. I feel like having a ghost kill is never really the worst idea as an army. Firepower that you literally can't take out at long range due to lone operative, and even if the enemy does get close, then it's fairly sturdy as well. Definitely a unit that you need to think about a little bit though to get the best value out of it. As for the points cost, its damage output is lower than most of the rest of the codex, though admittedly there's a good chance it might be being able to fire most of the game long due to its lone operative. In any case, that video was certainly a bit of an undertaking. Hope you liked just a few ideas as to one way that you could start each army in Warhammer 40k, and look forward to hearing any other tips, ideas, or things to go for early down in the comments below. As mentioned at the start of the video, if you were picking up any 40k kits or bits, feel free to check out the channel's affiliate discount retailers down in the video description, anywhere between 10 and 20% off Games Workshop miniatures, depending on where you are in the world. As ever, a massive thank you to you guys who do use those. It does help to support the channel and keep big projects like this video coming. Feel free to subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. And finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description down below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.